Hi everybody and welcome to our latest webinar as part of our LGBTQ history celebration. We've heard in our webinars so far some lived experience and a lot of local good practice. I'm really pleased today to welcome Jenny Douglas-Todd, the National Inclusion Director for NHS E&I and part of the People Directorate, and Jenny's going to talk us through the national agenda and the next steps. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and really glad to be speaking to you all this afternoon. My name is Jenny Douglas-Todd, as Anthony said. One of the things that I'm Director of Equality and Inclusion with NHS England and Improvement, and I do the role jointly with Mike Franklin. And one of the things that we are doing as part of our EDI team is supporting LGBT History Month this month. So doing various things in support of that. And so I was really pleased when I was invited to speak at this event to accept that offer and come along. Just a little bit about me. As Director of Equality and Inclusion, we cover all inclusion issues, all EDI issues. So from race to LGBT plus to disability, etc. So one of the things I will be talking about this afternoon is just giving a bit of insight into that. The other thing to say is in addition to being the Director of Equality and Inclusion, I am also independent chair of the Dorset Integrated Care System. So I've got a particular interest in ICSs. And so it's probably a really momentous day for me that the white paper has been published today when I'm speaking to you. And hopefully one of the things we can pick up will be around ICSs and moving those forward. So Ivor, can I ask you to move to the next slide, please? And at the moment, I'm just seeing you and Anthony. Can we go to the second slide? Thank you. So LGBT History Month, and we have here Marsha P. Johnston, who was an LGBT plus activist. This is a photograph that was done by Andy Warhol in 1975. And why have I started with this slide? Well, I just wanted to in part give my journey on LGBT plus, the LGBT plus agenda, and to talk a bit about people that have been really important for me as part of that agenda. Angela King Davis, and probably most of you will know her from the Black Panther movement, but she's also very much part of the LGBT community. And I was fortunate to do some work with her out in San Francisco, Los Angeles, a few years, some years ago. And she's very much part of the LGBT plus community and a real advocate for that community. James Baldwin, and why am I mentioning James Baldwin? Because in addition to race issues, a bit like Angela, he was very much an activist around LGBT plus. And I think both of them exemplify for me the intersectionality that is really important as part of the EDI agenda. Anning Turing, and he will be known to many people, not just because of the work that he did, but because he was, his life was ended because of the sheer discrimination that existed around being LGBT plus in the time that he was around. So he was convicted in 1952 for being homosexual, and that led to him taking his own life. And sadly, it wasn't until 2013 that he was pardoned. So, so some real kind of angst there, but lessons also for why we need to make sure that that we learn from history and that we are enabling people to be themselves and be properly part of our society and the NHS. Oscar Wilde, and Oscar is somebody that I've read quite a bit of, and would spend hours reading to my daughters when they were younger, because some really interesting stories. And I just loved his style of writing. But probably more importantly was the fact that he was openly gay in a period when it was not at all acceptable to be like that in the 1890s, and he was imprisoned because of that, and really sadly died impoverished because of the non-acceptance of his life. And more recently, I got to know Anne Lister, and I have to confess it wasn't somebody that I knew about until I watched the series a couple of years ago, and I found it fascinating for lots of different reasons, partly because she was happy to express herself and who she was, and that she wanted to have loving relationships with other women, and also because she had a phenomenal brain and a phenomenal intellect, which also was really unusual for those times. So I think she was somebody that was seen as odd for both respects, seen as having the brain and the ambitions of a man, at a time when women were meant to be subservient. And in addition to that, not only was she like that, but she was also possessing her love for other women. And she had to keep that secret. And it wasn't till her diaries were discovered in the walls of Chibden Hall. After I started looking at the series, one of the things I did was to go and read a bit about Anne Lister. And really interestingly, it was a member of the family later on, after Anne had died, that had discovered the diaries and decided to put them back into the wall and replaster the wall, because they were just still fearful, even all these years later, what it would mean for the family. So it was, I guess, some 20, 30 years after that, again, before it was rediscovered. So some quite fascinating parts to Anne Lister's life and legacy. And I mention all of these individuals not just because they've had some importance in my experience and my journey and my life, but because it's LGBT History Month, and I think it's really important that we embrace and embody the mind, body, and spirit as part of LGBT History Month. And the last thing I just wanted to say around my own kind of journey, during the late 1990s, I was obviously aware of and working around Section 28, and one of the things that I worked actively on at the time was in changing the ability for people to be openly gay in the armed forces, and I was doing that because at the time I was chair of the Association of Black Probation Officers, and one of the people that was leading and trying to fight this in the military came and asked for our support. So I was actively involved in that. But on the 17th of April, 1999, I was also chair of the Lambeth Community Police Consultative Group. Most of our meetings took place in Brixton, which is the kind of main town in Lambeth, in London. And I received a telephone call from the police who said that they needed to come and pick me up from my house and to take me into Brixton. They didn't explain why, but they said it was going to be Blues and Twos and that I needed to come straight away. So I sorted out childcare arrangements for my daughter at the time. The car promptly arrived and we went into Brixton in Blues and Twos. And it was on the way in that I had the senior officer speaking to me on the phone, who explained that a bomb had gone off in Brixton Market, and the police therefore wanted to work with me and other members of the advisory group to kind of think through next steps. And I remember turning up in a meeting in Brixton Police Station, in a meeting room in Brixton Police Station with the anti-terrorist squad who had arrived, who were then asking us some questions, telling us what they knew, being quite dismissive of some of the information that we were given. And at that stage, the anti-terrorism branch, their only experience of terrorism was Northern Ireland. And so their focus and their questioning was all around that experience. And we said, how do you know what this bomb was about? And like I said, they were quite dismissive. And we also said, how do you know it's not a race issue? And they were similarly dismissive. And we said, well, let's just hope there isn't another one, because from our perspective, although we didn't have any evidence at the time or any information, we just thought that given that it was in Brixton, which was known to be a community where Black people lived and thrived and worked and partied, that it was quite possible that there could be a racist motive. Anyway, that it wasn't taken on board. They left, and we felt quite dispirited by the way we were treated. The following weekend, there was a second bomb, and it was planted in Brick Lane. And to give credit to the Metropolitan Police, the anti-terrorist branch came back to us and said at that stage, given the first one was in Brixton, you know, known to be a Black community, now the second one is in Brick Lane, which has a big Asian community. Maybe there is something there around this being a hate crime incident. So at that stage, an advisory group was set up with the Metropolitan Police, held at Scotland Yard, which went out to broader communities to try and help to get the communities to work with the anti-terrorist branch, to see whether or not we could help them solve what was going on. And before we got to that stage, on the 30th of April, the third bomb was set off, and that was done in the Admiral Duncan pub, which was a pub that was known to be frequented by the gay community in Soho. And so that was the third bit in the triangle. And the person that set the bomb, it was just told, was somebody called David Copeland, and he was eventually sentenced to imprisonment. And the reason I wanted to talk about that story is because of the aspect that linked all of those three bombs together, which was one of hate, and exemplifies why it is important that we work actively on an EDI agenda, and exemplifies why it's important that we do focus on an intersectional approach, because if people hate individuals because they are different, then that hate spreads across. So it's not just about being Black, it's not just being about being LGBT, but we need to ensure that we are able to, certainly in the NHS, bring our whole selves to work and embrace our whole selves. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So one of the reasons that I'm here today is to talk about the People Plan, which hopefully you will all be familiar with, and the People Plan promise that comes as part of that. And what's quite kind of significant for me around the People Plan is that probably for the first time in the NHS's 72-year history, we have a people strategy that's been set out that talks about belonging. And that's really enriching and empowering, particularly for all of us working in the NHS, but also for those of us that work on that EDI agenda. And so that second pillar, there are kind of four pillars to the People Plan, but that second pillar around belonging is where the EDI team's work is rooted. And we work with the EDI leads at the regional level, EDI leads at organisational level, HRDs at regional and local level, to see and ensure that we can deliver on the People Plan priorities and the People Plan promise. And one of the things that we did, for example, this week was to have our roundtable with the LGBT plus community to not just think through how we're delivering against the People Plan promises that run until June of this year, with a big focus on delivery on some of those priorities by the end of March of 2021, but also to set out our stall around the future People Plan and the future EDI work plan to ensure that we can co-design and work with communities around that delivery. And for some reason, my monitor's gone off, so I can't see what's next. But can I ask, it's come back up actually, so thank you. Can I ask for the next slide, please? So I mentioned already that the EDI team sits within the People Directorate. We are a national team. The People Directorate itself was brought into being in about 2 years ago, so April 2019. The EDI team itself was set up in April of last year, so it is a relatively new team. Mike, my co-director, joined NHSEI as Director of Equality and Inclusion in July of 2020 last year, and I came in on the 1st of September. So the EDI team itself is new, the leadership is relatively new, and part of the work that we've been doing is to bring into being one team, because the team itself was brought together from various different bits of NHS Improvement and NHS England. And so we're working together to have a collective and wholesale approach to EDI. I mentioned already that we're focused on the second pillar of the People Plan, so I won't go through that again. But a lot of what we're doing is aligning our focus on the LGBT plus as part of that, and working with the LGBT plus communities and networks in that delivery. Got a problem here, and I haven't quite worked out what it is, but my monitor keeps going off. So, so we are using data to help us to deliver on the agenda. What's really clear for Mike and I is that what our role is to ensure that we are making a difference for people out in the work environment. So policies, procedures, metrics, all of those things are important. But actually, if they're not shifting your experience, then we would have to question why we're doing it. So, so we are very much about wanting to make how it looks and feels to be LGBT plus in the NHS different, that you feel that you can bring your whole self to work, that you feel that you can actively work with others on this agenda, and that together we can make a difference in shaping the belonging agenda moving forward. So we do part of that through ensuring that we've got those relationships across, so that the golden thread is running through, as I said, from the national down to the local. We're complementing the work that's led by Dr. Michael Brady, who leads on the National LGBT Health Team. And we work quite closely on some of that agenda, including in delivering and interacting on the LGBT roundtables. Next slide, please. So this slide just sets out a bit more around the engagement and experience insights that we're doing. So as I've said, you know, it's not just about us doing what we think is right or what we want to do, but it's actually working with LGBT people to make sure that that's right. Ensuring that we are addressing and challenging some of these societal issues, because the NHS does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in society. And some of the examples that I gave earlier on around that history is really important for us to understand, to make sure we are shifting that agenda. It also links very clearly to health inequalities. And as an ICS chair, I mentioned earlier that it's the integrated care system is really important to me, and health inequalities is a big part of that integrated care be in. So when I joined as the Dorset chair in March 2020, so last year. So I started 2 jobs during COVID, which is interesting in itself. But one of the things I did last year was to move the Dorset integrated care system from 53 priorities down to 2 priorities. And those 2 priorities are inequalities, health inequalities, and making sure that we focus our resources, our energies, our expectations and our vision around addressing those inequalities. And the second is around recovery. And that's not just recovery in the sense of standing back up elected services, but it's recovery in the broader sense, working across the system to ensure that that we can help Dorset to be one of the best places to live and work. And that will mean addressing harm that sits in the community, in part in response to COVID-19, but also some of the things that might be coming out from COVID-19, such as mental health, economic issues, etc. And linked to that is really understanding any inequity that exists within the employee experience. And so we pick part of that up through the NHS staff survey, but we're looking across other metrics and bringing the various metrics that we have in the EDI team together to ensure that we can properly understand that inequity of experience, particularly for LGBT staff. Really important that we're increasing that voice and visibility. And so all of the activities that we're doing focus in that area. But we also, as part of the EDI team, have an allyship and activism team. And that's to help us to work to ensure that we are raising the voices, not just through the community itself, but bringing in allies and thinking through the activism. And staff networks, we are in the process of getting communication out to the regions and to organisations around staff networks, and very much as part of that focused on ensuring that all organisations have an LGBT plus staff network. Next slide, please. This just says a bit more about network considerations, and one of the things that we're looking at is the new report from the University of York, which was a 3-year study to understand the LGBT plus employee networks which operate within the NHS. And there's a link there. I think these slides will be made available to you, but there's a link there where you can get some more information. And then the last slide, please. And so this slide just covers some of the things that we're doing. So obviously the NHS People Plan is really important. That drives our agenda, and it ensures that the LGBT community has a voice. And as I said before, that it addresses the belonging part of the agenda. We have our strategy and work plan, so not just the People Plan itself, but also there's an EDI work plan that very much puts LGBT clearly as part of the work that we're doing. We're developing and have developed strategic partnerships, and those strategic partnerships are internal to the NHS. And I talked already about some of the networks and the EDI leads, etc., but also external to that. We're mapping the LGBT plus networks across the country, and part of that is we want to understand where there's good practice so that that could be promulgated even greater, but also to understand where there's a variance. And we're developing tools and guidance. So I mentioned earlier about LGBT plus networks and expecting that organisations will have those in place, and some of these important tools and guidance will assist those organisations that need it. And lastly, I've already spoken about amplifying the voices and expertise, and I'm hoping that I will hear some more today that will enable and encourage us and help us to continue to exemplify those voices. So thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say in terms of my contribution, and I'm happy to take any questions. Probably just the last thing to say, there's on that last slide, you would have seen that there was a link which takes you to a video. So when you get access to these, please feel free to watch those videos. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions, Anthony.
Great, Jenny, thank you so much. That's really informative. There are some questions popping up. So the first one really just goes back to your point at the beginning and the relevance of today around ICS and closer working between health and social care. So kind of from your perspective of your role as a chair, what are some of the top tips and conversations you think we could have about keeping the thread of inclusiveness alive in those ICS developing conversations?
The first thing I would say is to get some clarity to ensure that inequity and inequality is properly part of the consideration of the ICS, because that vision, setting out that vision right from the outset, will ensure that we can then actively work and engage together on that agenda. So that will be the first thing that I would say. The second part would be to ensure that we can properly include the voice of our communities within that. And I mean all communities, not just staff communities, but also the populations, the communities in the populations that these systems will serve. And so that means really thinking about how do we ensure that we are designing the future with communities, not for communities or about communities. So the ability to get the LGBT plus voice into the design of the system is really important. And then I guess the last thing that I would say would be a key component and principle is to understand where that inequity sits at the moment across those systems, both in terms of the organisations that make up the NHS and the broader partner organisations that will form the systems, and then focusing down then on how do we make sure that we are building our system in a way that will address those inequities. So those will be the top three things that I would focus on.
That's really helpful. Great, thank you. Really, really helpful top tips from that perspective, because that's a voice we don't often hear. So I think you've kind of here with two hats on in a sense. We really wanted to hear about the national work around supporting LGBTQ, but also I wanted to take the chance of you being here to ask that additional sort of really burning and relevant question today. Yeah. We've had another question in the chat about the activism and allyship team. How could people find out a bit more about how that works? How can they engage with that? And how can they offer support?
So what I can do is to provide the head's email address or the central mailbox where we're more than happy for you to make contact with us. There are various things that the team have done, certainly before I joined. So one of the things they did was to set up an allyship programme, and those are currently being rolled out across different organisations. So if people aren't aware of that, then please email in when I get the email address to you, Anthony and Ivo, and then we can link you in touch with those organisations that are doing that. And then there are various blogs that have been done, and we're looking at other things that we can do at the moment to just kind of raise the agenda and the profile around the allyship and activism programme. The one thing that I would want to say is that looking at where we are with COVID-19 and the inequity that has been exemplified through COVID-19, there has never been a greater time for activism and allyship. And if we don't get on top of that agenda now, then we will have missed a trick, because it's really clear that these, the shaping agenda, the change agenda, is not just going to happen by osmosis. It's going to happen because we are pushing it there, and we are building that kind of momentum around people that would also support that. So it's a really important agenda, and please feel free to come forth with ideas, practices where you think that's happening actively already, and of course ask for questions, support, and resources to enable you to live that within your own organisations.
That's really helpful, thank you. And then we have another question around targets and representation. So we understand about the 19% BAME and BME colleagues, and we're all working with plans to implement that, and we fully understand why. There's a question about how we might put other targets in place, or whether targets are in fact the way forward to ensure effective and visible representation at all levels. So that kind of aspirational place that the people plan helps us articulate and get to. What do you think? Do you think targets are a lever, or are there other things we could be doing? And if targets are a lever, would we be thinking about targets for all groups, not just BAME and BME?
Yeah, so I think targets can be a lever, but I think they can also be a misnomer. So I think one of the issues with metrics is that organisations can get caught up in just counting the numbers and doing very little about it. And so that's why I said that, you know, Mike and I are focused on what it looks and feels like in reality, because, you know, we could have targets till the cows come home, but actually if it's not shifting that experience, then I would question the value of having the target. Part of this for me comes from my experience of leading on the Home Secretary's race equality employment targets that were set following the inquiry into the handling of the Stephen Lawrence murder by the Metropolitan Police, and that was led by Sir William Macpherson. And one of the things the Labour government said at the time when that was done was that if they got into power, that they would implement those recommendations. And Jack Straw, who was the Home Secretary at the time, decided that he would take forward targets around the recruitment, retention and promotion of Black and minority ethnic people within the Home Office and its services. So that included policing, fire, Home Office, etc. And what we did, so I had to, you know, I had the grand job of leading on implementing those targets. And one of the things that I did for that actually was to set up a targets workforce, just for the same reason that it would, you know, we could set the targets, we could leave organisations to get on and deliver them. But the key thing was actually making that change. And so the whole point of that task force was to learn from others about how could we make some tangible differences that enabled people working in those organisations to not just see that change was happening, but actually feel that change was happening. And when we reported on the first milestones, all of the organisations, with the exception of the police, had achieved their first milestones. The police, however, were 0.01% off. And the reason I give that as an example is that there was, through having a focus on actual tangible change and wanted to make that difference, we phenomenally, I mean, nobody expected those milestones to be achieved, but they were achieved. And if you look at policing now, what you will find is that it's less representative than it was then. And that's partly because we had a whole sway of chief constables who decided before the 10 years was up, because the targets were set for 10 years, before the 10 years were up, that they had delivered on that agenda. They didn't need to focus on race anymore. And we've seen through the Black Lives Matter movement that there are some real consequences of not focusing on race. So I think the important thing here, Anthony, for whoever raised that question, is that what we need to get right is the actual experience, the culture and behaviours that exist, and then try and get some metrics to support that so that we can continue to measure. So we are looking as an EDI team around how do we triangulate data and metrics that already exist to then either set some challenges for organisations or set some targets. And so I would say watch this space around whether or not we do anything more for LGBT+, but with the emphasis being on it's the lived experience that's important for us.
No, it's a great answer. Thank you. I absolutely agree with that approach. I do think it is. I think targets can become a tick box exercise, and it's not about this. This is about sustaining change, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Question in the chat about ESR. So how can we talk about being inclusive when trans and non-binary and intersex colleagues are not recognised in the ESR system?
Yeah, and this is something that we are passionate about, and I have to say that that Prerna herself, as the Chief People Officer, is determined there will be some change. So Prerna actually wrote a letter last year requesting that change be made, because if we don't recognise that as part of the ESR set up, then that's well, it's one of the ways of belonging, isn't it? If trans and non-binary and you can't see yourself in that, it's a key part. So Prerna wrote that letter last year. We had I mentioned earlier that we had an LGBT plus roundtable at the beginning of this week, where Prerna updated and told the roundtable that she had written that letter, and we are about to put some information out to the attendees of that roundtable around what was included in the letter from Prerna. The trans and non-binary roundtable is happening as we speak. So Prerna will be updating to those roundtable participants there also around this issue. And we are thinking through as an EDI team, how do we make sure that change happens quicker rather than later. It's a really technical issue, and it's stuff that I'm just beginning to understand myself around ESR, but nonetheless, it's an important agenda for us. So, so please be assured that we agree with you that it's very important, and we will continue to push against that door.
Jenny, that's really good to know, because we rely on ESR so much for a baseline of our information, and we don't understand what we have. And if we don't understand what we have, we can't work forward.
That's right.
Really appreciate that. Okay, so Evo has just posted our evaluation SurveyMonkey into the chat. So if people could take a few minutes to do that, I'd be really grateful. It helps us plan future sessions. And if anybody has any questions for Jenny, please do post them. I think we've got about 5 more minutes of her time, so it'd be really good to answer any other questions. Jenny's kindly agreed that if any questions come in after she's gone, that we can forward them to her, but it would be good to take the opportunity now.
And Eva and Anthony, if I don't know if you've got the EDI Central mailbox email address. If you have, maybe stick that in the chat also, so that if people want to get in contact around the allyship and activism programme, they can do.
Great idea. I'll do that now. Thank you. Brilliant idea. I'll try and multitask.
Something we're all having to learn to do, isn't it? So
maybe not as good as I thought.
So if they're, I don't want to labour it. If people have run out of questions, shall we bring it to a close, or are there things coming through?
There is one question on the wall.
There we go. Okay, yeah. So, what's your opinion on NHS staff including their pronouns on their signatures? Our senior team had them for a period of time, but they've disappeared. I was wondering if you had any knowledge of the impact of the pronouns.
Yeah, really interesting. So I mentioned that I started on the 1st of September, and not long after I started, we held the first LGBT plus roundtable and trans and non-binary roundtable, and that was quite an impactful roundtable, or roundtables, I should say. Impactful because a lot of the focus at the time was around the use of the rainbow in the People Promise, and some of the issues that had developed in the development of the People Plan. And one of the discussions that we had, particularly in the second roundtable with the trans and non-binary, was exactly around pronouns and whether or not people should be using them. And the conclusion was that this it's an individual choice. Certainly not all of the participants in the trans and non-binary roundtable felt that it was important. In fact, quite a few of those that were not talking adversely about it, but the people that were not as keen to have pronouns used were very much, I guess, saying some of the stuff that I've said today, that at the end of the day, it's about reality for them, and it's about how they feel part of the organisations and the teams that they're working in. That's more important than seeing something that could just be symbolic by having pronouns. So I think it's a personal choice. We as an EDI team have not stipulated for our team members one way or the other, but the vast majority of the team, I would say, do use pronouns in their signature sign-off. I guess if I'm in an organisation where senior leaders were using it and that's dropped off, I would want to be having the conversation openly about why that is. You know, is it because they felt it was just taking a sit and there was more that they should be doing, or is it something else? And it might be useful to just have that conversation, because I think with all of the EDI agenda, it is about us having conversations. Things change all of the time. Perceptions move on, expectations move on, but the thing that shouldn't shift is that we have to talk openly and respectfully about these issues to make sure that we are taking people's expectations and needs forward.
Great, Jenny. Really helpful answer. Thank you very much. I think the key, respectful asking and respectful answering and listening and hearing are the really powerful messages out of that. I think we have to have confidence to learn together, but it does mean we have to do that respectfully.
Yes.
Okay, Jenny, thank you so much. We haven't got any more questions, and I do know you have to go. Really grateful for your contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you stay safe and well, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you to everybody that joined. Bye-bye.